farming, for fuel, or digging our grave. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about the issue of biofuels and the environmental impacts associated with land use. I'm John Urbanchuk. I am an assistant professor, and I'm chairman of the agribusiness department here at Delaware Valley University. And we've got a really great panel today to work with us on these particular issues, I told you I'm here at Del Val, but in the spirit of full disclosure, I do need to tell you that for the past 25 or more years, and including up to today, I have been providing economic support and policy consulting to the U.S. biofuels industry. I work for the National Renewable Fuels Association and Renewable Fuels Associations in Iowa, Minnesota, Indiana, and Missouri, from time to time Missouri, and National Biodiesel Board and the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. Just so you know that, because that tells you that I've got a bit of a bias on the side of biofuels. We are joined today by Paul Winters. Paul is Director of Communications for the biotechnology organization, the industry organization, BIO, in Washington, D.C., and Paul was good enough to drive up here from Washington today to participate in this. BIO, if you don't know, is the primary trade group that represents the biotechnology industry. They're doing an awful lot of work in the area specifically of biofuels, not the first generation necessarily, but in future generations of biofuels. Paul's got a master's degree in political science from UC Davis, and he's the co-author of a number of articles contributed to the Science magazine and the Biotechnology Journal, many having to do with the issues of land use and the environmental issues and life cycle analysis in the area of biofuels. And then we've got Tim Serchinger, who's going to be joining us via Skype from Washington if we can get this thing set up. Tim is the research scholar at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow and technical director at the World Resources Institute, and is director of the Agricultural Synergies Project, which is a collaborative international project that develops guidance for developing countries on strategies to boost agricultural production while reducing emissions and reducing greenhouse gases. His primary research combines ecology and economics to analyze the challenge of how to feed a growing world while reducing land use change and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. I think it's safe to say that we've got two speakers on opposite sides of the topic. Tim is probably one of the better known critics of biofuels, particularly with regard to their environmental implications. Paul, on the other hand, from the Bio Industry Association, takes a more pragmatic view and looks at the other side. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. All right. So with that, what I wanted to do is just go through a minute or two to give you sort of an overview of what we're talking about here. I don't know if he's back on yet or not, but let's talk about this, okay? So what are biofuels? And what do we talk about when we're talking about what biofuels are, okay? There are two primary biofuels we're talking about. They're liquid fuels that are made from biomaterial. Anything that grows, basically has internal carbohydrates that can be converted into starch. The two primary ones are ethanol, which is an alcohol that's produced from converting the starch in plant material and growing material, all of that, into sugars, or recovering the sugar directly, distilling that, converting sugar into alcohol through distillation, distilling it and recovering the alcohol. That alcohol is used as a fuel, biofuel. Ethanol, we call it. You may know it as vodka, bourbon, gin, not gin, vodka and bourbon. It is an alcohol, and it is one of the oldest known products in the world. The other is biodiesel. Biodiesel is not an alcohol, but basically it's an ester fuel. It's a methyl ester that is derived from a production process called transesterification using either virgin vegetable oil, which is soybean oil, or palm oil, palm kernel oil, any of the virgin oils, animal fats, or waste greases and fats. And through that process, you can produce an ASTM product that is used in place of petroleum diesel fuel. And we have with us Dr. Ron Petruccio, who is a professor of organic chemistry here at Del. Many of you know Ron. Ron's been working in the area of biofuels and has a patent pending, an international patent pending, that deals with taking oil from tobacco leaves and converting that into a biofuel. And Ron will talk to us a little about that. So that's what biofuels are. So why biofuels? Okay. Well, the whole issue of biofuels have developed largely, and let me see my own slides here, out of concerns that arose from the Arab oil embargoes of the 1970s and early 1980s, and concerns over the availability of and the supply of oil and the supply of fuel. You go back, the ethanol industry has been around for a very, very long time. In fact, biofuels were really the first sources of fuel that were used in internal combustion engines and in diesel engines. Henry Ford designed the Model T to run on alcohol. Rudolf Diesel designed a diesel engine to run on peanut oil. It wasn't until the 1920s, the early part of the 20th century, when the oil industry really started to get its development, and we discovered oil down in Texas and Oklahoma, and then subsequently in the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia, what was then Arabia, did the oil industry really begin to develop and shifted away from biofuels into petroleum fuels, and that becomes a whole different story in and of itself. The other primary concern was environmental, and there are significant environmental advantages to using biofuels. In the case of ethanol, clean air. In the case of biodiesel, clean air as well, reduced particulate emissions, those kinds of issues. So those are the two primary reasons why we have biofuels. Biofuels have been here for a while, and they're here to stay. What I'm showing you here basically is a projection that was done by the World Bank, Food and Agricultural Organization, that looks at where biofuels are produced and where the expectation is over the next 20 or so years of what biofuel use is going to look like. This is ethanol. The blue down at the bottom is the United States, the green is Brazil. Our two countries, we're bigger than they are with regard to production, account for somewhere around 90% of all the ethanol produced in the world. You can see the other countries, and that's where the growth is going to come from. Primary feedstocks for biofuels for ethanol, as I told you, are starch from grains, primarily corn in the United States, and sugar comes from sugar cane. There are other products that you can use, but those are the primary first-generation biofuels. On the biodiesel side, biodiesel industry hasn't been around as long as the ethanol industry has. It's probably about 15 or 20 years old. That's about it. It goes maybe 15 years. But again, here you're looking at a circumstance where these are the major producers of biodiesel, and you'll notice that the United States is not the top one. European Union is. The reason for that has to go back again to oil prices and oil availability. And the reason why Europeans use a lot more diesel engines than we do here. The gasoline is much more expensive in Europe because they don't have any of it. They have to bring it all in themselves from somebody else. As a consequence, the development of engines there really went to the use of diesel fuel. And as a consequence, they're producing more biodiesel than we are. But that biodiesel growth is expected to continue. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind that biofuels have been policy driven, and the growth in biofuels has been policy driven. Any alternative fuel, I don't care if it's biofuels, electric, solar, wind, geothermal, has got to compete with a very, very well-established, well-funded, and mature petroleum industry. Consequently, it takes some form of support in order to get that infant industry to develop to the point it becomes an adolescent and eventually a mature industry. Ethanol industry is at the point where it's now a late adolescent, early adult. Biodiesel industry is a little bit behind that. But the point is that we've had a couple of major policies. First of all, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 required that you add an oxygenate to motor gasoline. What do you do when you add oxygen to something? It burns hotter. It burns cleaner. You have fewer emissions of ozone-forming compounds and greenhouse gases, or that would lead for greenhouse gas formation. The two primary oxygenates that were available when the Clean Air Act amendments were written were one, ethanol, N2 MTBE, methyl tertiary butyl ether, which had all kinds of problems associated with it, persistence. If you spilled ethanol into a well or into a stream, everything that God created loves alcohol. And the microbes absorb that alcohol very, very quickly, and it has a very, very short half-life. MTBE, on the other hand, has a very, very long half-life. In the ethanol industry, we used to say if you spilled MTBE into a well, you have to cap it. If you spill ethanol into a well, you add ice and have a party. Well, not too different from that, okay? The point of the matter is that MTBE also smells bad. It has a very, very nasty odor. And any kind of gasoline spilled that had MTBE in it, it became very obnoxious to people. And as a consequence of the oil companies voluntarily, under government pressure, withdrew MTBE from the marketplace, meaning ethanol was the primary oxygen available. That program has been incredibly successful. Our air today is cleaner than it has been at any time in the last, I think it's safe to say, probably 50 or 75 years, largely because we've improved the quality of our gasoline by adding that in. The next policy was the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which continued that. That put in place the first renewable fuel mandate, which basically, again, back in 2005, said that by 2012 we should use 7.5 billion gallons of renewable fuels in the nation's motor fuel supply. Anybody know about how much gasoline we use a year in the United States, roughly?
130 million.
About 130 billion gallons. So 7.5 billion gallons of renewable fuels is a real drop in the bucket. And we moved along that line. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 came along and expanded that mandate to 36 billion gallons of renewable fuels in the nation's motor fuel supply by 2022. That mandate is still in place today, and that's what we're working on. The policy has been successful. This is the growth in ethanol production in the United States from 1981 to the estimate today of about 14.7 billion gallons in 2015. And when you take a look at this, let's have a, whoop, didn't want to do that. If you take a look at this, my little pointer here, you can see that significant growth. Well, it doesn't like the pointer. That significant growth happened just about the time those policies went into place. Okay? So we've seen very, very significant growth in ethanol production. Okay? So where do we need to go? This is that renewable fuel mandate that we talked about, broken into its components. The yellow is cornstarch, which is capped at 15 billion gallons this year. Okay? Right now, we're producing a little better than 14.2 of corn-based ethanol, so we're not quite at that cap yet. The red is ethanol from cellulose, the second generation, and Paul's going to talk a little bit about that. The white is biomass biodiesel, relatively small amount. And the green is all other advanced biofuels, which means biofuels that are coming from something other than cellulose or cornstarch. Okay? So what are the primary issues that we're dealing with here? The first one of those is food for fuel, and that is the notion that if you take land, take it out of production of crops that would be used for human food, that basically what you would do is you would have an impact on food supplies that would drive food prices up and create mass starvation. All right? That controversy has been around for about a decade now, and the empirical evidence suggests that it's baloney. It's not happening. And in fact, if you take a look at the growth in world food prices, and I have a chart that talks about this and shows this, I'll come back and talk about that, between 2005 and 2011, world food prices increased about 123%, while biofuels production in the United States increased 300%. But if you look at 2011 to 2015, biofuels production continued to increase and world food prices are down about 25%. So the relationship there, and the World Bank has done studies, and they've had to come back and review those studies and revise the conclusions that biofuels are not really the primary cause for increases in food production. But nonetheless, that's still there, and that's one of the other key issues that comes back to this point of land use. And that is that increased demand for biofuels will encourage land to be shifted from one crop to another. That would encourage cutting down rainforests in Brazil and in Malaysia and in Indonesia, where palm and palm coral oil is produced. Despite the fact they have laws against doing that, it would encourage people to make cropping change patterns that would then also have a negative impact on food supplies and food prices, and at the same time have deleterious environmental impacts, that is, release more greenhouse gases. And with that, I'm going to shut up and turn it over to our speakers, because those are the two issues we're going to talk about. Are there any questions? Jackie, you had a point you wanted to raise.
Well, I see those two issues, which are very important, but you neglect to mention that the fact that of the 100 million acres of corn that we grow, virtually 99% of it receives vast amounts of pesticides, and so I believe that should be an issue that's up there.
Well, that's actually, that in some instances, yes, that's true, but there has been, and again, this opens a different can of worms, is that virtually all of the corn area, and I say virtually, it's about 95% of all the corn area in the United States today is planted with GMO seeds. And in large part, the movement toward the use of GMO seeds was in direct response to try and reduce the amount of pesticides that were applied.
Right, so now we're using more Roundup, both in soybeans and in corn, which Roundup, as we know, is just named a carcinogen.
It's suspected carcinogen. It has not been, it is, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, because when you read the press, and I'm not here on Monsanto's behalf, okay? Although I will tell you, and again, full disclosure, that I was involved in the economic feasibility of the development of Roundup way, way, way back, okay? The point of the matter is that it is suspected, it's not been proven. In much the same way that MTBE is a suspected carcinogen, but it's not a proven carcinogen. That may be Tim. No. I'm just going to leave that there. Apologize about that. So it's a suspected carcinogen, but the point of the matter is that, yes, you're right. The impact of inputs, not just pesticides, okay, but also fertilizers, and the impact of fertilizers on water quality is an issue that has to be dealt with. That's quite clear. But again, the alternatives associated with crops, other crops, have some of those same issues and problems. Okay, but you're right. But those are tied up in these issues. And I would say that's one of the potentially deleterious impacts of biofuels. So with that, I've talked too long. And how do we do this?
Can I ask one quick question?
Yes, go ahead.
You also dropped something else.
Yeah, I'm not going to bother to.
I've had a real problem with black and white either or thinking, and that's what this is. Why can't a farmer grow both? Why can't he grow what he wants to grow and then grow something for the fuel and then work back and forth and use the land optimally to accomplish both?
Say that again. I'm not sure I followed that.
Why can't a given farmer, any given farmer, grow for both purposes on the same plot of land instead of either or? You know, we're talking that one's fighting the other.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, that has been what has happened essentially with the added demand for corn for biofuels. Some corn has been
Allocated.
has pushed out other crops like cotton, which was moving overseas in the first place. But the primary response has been to increase the intensity of corn planting, so planting more corn per acre or rotating crops.
Rather than
Yeah.
rotation, which is a natural phenomenon.
The other answer to the question is that the market determines where the farmer is going to sell his corn, where he's going to get the highest return for that. And the market, in large part, one of the other reasons that we've seen an increase in the amount of corn that's used for biofuels is that the farmer's getting a return for that. There's a market-based return as opposed to a government-based return on that. So he's going to sell it where he gets the highest potential return. So that the existence of that industry helps the farmer with a particular market.
Hello. Hello, Tim. Hi.
Okay, Tim, this is John Urbanchuk. We have been talking, and I've been giving you an introduction, and we're about ready as soon as I get your slides up. And how do we?
Oh, you have this presentation on here?
Yeah.
So you're done with yours?
Yeah, I'll go through that. Tim, I'm going to put your PowerPoint up and go through it as you call the slide numbers, okay?
That's fine.
We've
Great.
got about 25 people, maybe a bit more in the audience, very, very engaged audience. Paul Winters from Biotechnology Industry Association is going to be following you, point counterpoint. And I've got Dr. Ron Petruccio, who's a professor of organic chemistry, who's also going to talk about what he's been doing in the area of biofuels development using tobacco. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Nope.
Are you there?
Refresh.
Oh, I love technology.
What can go wrong with things?
Say again? Do I have one?
You have lots of-
I don't have copies. I have just a few copies, but I will make them available. They will.
Just pray you guys.
Oh, yeah.
Copies of all the handouts will be available. Thank you, Tyler.
He's on.
Tim? Tim?
Would it be better to do just phone instead of video?
You can also call me on the landline as you are already had my presentation. There's this number.
As it turns out, that was him calling me. 301?
301-585-9635.
Maybe that one, put it on speaker.
That's the speaker? While we're doing this, Paul, I'm going to ask Paul to go ahead and we'll get you up on this.
All right, well, I want to thank Professor Urbanchuk and Dr. Michael Stamps for allowing me to be here. Your program says Brent Erickson, who is one of my bosses, and I'm filling in for him today. So thank you all for your participation and for your attention this afternoon. I know that a dull speaker on an afternoon panel can send you all skulking for the door, so I'll do my best. I'm Director of Communications for the Biotechnology and Industry Organization. We're the largest trade association for the biotech industry. And when you say biotechnology, most people think the healthcare industry. About 90% of our members are involved in healthcare. But the other 10% are involved in agriculture and in solutions for biofuels. So, that was the wrong button. There we go. Thanks. So, first point I want to make today is that biofuels can be done right. And I know the title of this session here is farming for fuel or digging our graves. And I think too much of the debate around biofuels and bioenergy is driven by categoric thinking of that sort. So we have people who say biofuels are either unconditionally good or purely evil. And we have people who say any biofuel is automatically better than corn ethanol. And then we have people who say that agriculture can only be used for food or for carbon absorption, and you can't use it for biofuels. That kind of thinking inevitably leads us to circular arguments. All right, so the second point I want to make, in order to do biofuels right, you have to grow the biomass right. And then farming is not an extractive industry. It's not equivalent to drilling for oil or mining for coal. I know some people do see it that way. They see agriculture or forestry as an extractive industry. But a farmer that doesn't act as a steward of his land will put himself out of business, will put future generations out of business. So that's fundamentally different from mining. And the final point I'll make today is that biofuel and bioenergy producers should be allowed to take credit for the carbon and biomass. And that's because they pay for it. And they provide a market incentive to renew it and replant it. Market incentives also lean toward doing the biomass right. That's not a guarantee. So, what you see here on the right is a model of the Earth's carbon cycle. And the image comes from NASA, the US Space Agency. The cycle is not in equilibrium. We know that, that's part of the problem. So we're adding more and more carbon to the atmosphere, and it's adding carbon to the ocean, and the ocean is acidifying. So that's a dangerous situation for sea life. It's a dangerous situation for trying to absorb more carbon. And that makes it a danger to us. This graphic illustrates a tool that countries use to evaluate their carbon emissions. Our US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, produces the inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks, and they count up all the carbon emissions and all the carbon sinks in our economy. It's often called carbon accounting. I'm sure you're all familiar with accounting software like Microsoft Excel, where if you change any variable in the spreadsheet, it cascades through all the other values in the spreadsheet. But that's a false analogy to this model. It's inappropriate to say that you can't use biomass for energy over here because it's going to disrupt the balance of carbon emissions from the fossil fuel industry over there. That argument derives from a false premise of equilibrium in the model. A better analogy is the tragedy of the commons. So each individual actor here has to be held as responsible for their contribution to the common good or the common problem in this case. It's a better analogy than equilibrium because this system is not in stasis. So the population is continually increasing, which means there's additional demand for food, energy, wood products, cement, plastics. And those are all very real human needs. Right now, I'm particularly grateful for cement, plastics, and wood products because they're all around us. We also need new economic opportunities for all those people. Farmers need a fair return on what they grow. or else they can't keep growing. And most of the time, economic opportunities rely on mobility and energy. So for all those reasons, I think renewable biomass is a better, more sustainable way to meet these needs than continued reliance on fossil fuel. How do we know that bioenergy is a better choice? One of the tools we use is life cycle analysis. And that's an assessment of all the energy and carbon flows associated with any product. Now this is a nice drawing, right? The sun shining, you can almost hear the birds singing. Does the model prove that biofuels and bioenergy are carbon neutral? No. Of course it doesn't. All it represents is an inventory of all the factors we need to consider if we're going to say that biofuels are better, or that one biofuel is better than another. So biofuels and bioenergy have to be done right. There are energy and carbon flows throughout this model.
It was working though, right?
What's wrong was?
That's good.
Yeah, no, that's.
So including in the farming and harvesting of the biomass, producing co-products with biofuels, and transporting the biofuels and the biomass to the market or to the refinery. So each of those carbon flows in biofuels production can be improved and optimized. Farming systems can be improved with tools such as conservation tillage, cover crops that help to reduce soil carbon loss. But the biggest requirement is that the biomass is replanted and renewed, because we have to close the carbon cycle. So you could assess bioenergy carbon debt right at the start of the process. In a life cycle analysis, that's perfectly fine. As long as you recognize that there's a market incentive to replant it. And that's what biorefineries do. They provide a steady demand for the biomass, for the crops. In fact, most create contracts with local farmers to ensure they have a biomass supply for many, many years. So through that system, they put a price on carbon renewing and recycling. All right, so there are next generation biofuels that don't compete with food crops. And those advanced biofuel producers are now coming online. So we have companies that make fuels, cellulosic ethanol from crop waste. We have algae biofuels companies. And we have a few others that use waste products like flue gases. Those companies have been working on these technologies for more than a decade. And they've now reached the stage of commercial development that corn ethanol production reached about 2 decades ago. They've got these first-of-kind biorefineries operating in place. They've proven the technology works. They're optimizing it. And once they're optimized, they can be replicated quickly, the way that corn ethanol took off in the mid-2005, 2006 range, because they simply replicated existing biorefineries. Poet DSM here on the right. They were one of the first large-scale cellulosic ethanol producers. And what they use is corn cobs and leaves that are harvested within 50 miles of their plant in Emmitsburg, Iowa. And they're one of 3 large-scale cellulosic producers that are operating today or starting up operation today that use crop waste from corn plants. Abengoa is another one. They have a large-scale facility in Hugoton, Kansas. They also use wheat straw. And at the end of this month, DuPont is going to cut the ribbon on their new plant in Nevada, Iowa. As I said, they've all been at that technology for more than a decade now. And I've worked at the biotechnology industry for 12 years, so I've watched them from almost the start. As they've been building and planning their facilities over the past 3 years, I know they've worked with farmers in their local area to establish contracts to get the harvesting of corn stover started, to get enough supply for their facilities, and to make sure it was being done right. DuPont worked with USDA to set up best practices and to ensure that those best practices were followed. And most interesting about the three companies is that they've located their cellulosic biorefineries right next to corn ethanol refineries. And their strategy in doing that is to improve the economy of scale. So the cellulosic ethanol plants provide heat and electricity for themselves and then for the corn ethanol plant next door. It also gives the farmers one location to deliver both the corn and the corn stover. But alginol, as its name hints, it's bringing ethanol from algae to market, and they're ready to go this year. They received approval from EPA to produce this fuel. They've been working on their technology nearly as long as the cellulosic ethanol producers. And what they've done is genetically engineer an algae strain to produce ethanol, something that it normally would not do. And they've built a plant in Fort Myers, Florida. That's sort of an aerial view of it. What they're doing is demonstrating the commercial viability of this system, and they're producing a small amount of fuel. But their goal is to co-locate one of these plants with a large electricity producer to take the waste gases from the electricity plant and feed it to the algae. There are a couple other companies like Jewel Bio and Sapphire Energy that you might hear of doing the same thing within the next 5 years. LanzaTech is a third company. They're a bit on the far left, right. My left, your right, sorry. So what they do is use a microbe that directly metabolizes flue gases. And they can turn those flue gases into ethanol or a higher chain alcohol that mimics a jet fuel. And they have already built small-scale demonstration units next to steel producers. So they're taking the waste gas that the steel company would pump straight into the air, and they are feeding it to this microbe, and they're producing either ethanol or another chemical with it. There are several companies that use similar technology. The technology came out of the University of Florida. Callista Energy, Coscata, and Ineos Bio, you might hear of doing this.
Hello?
And Ineos Bio was one of the first companies in the United States to produce cellulosic ethanol. Tim, is that you on the phone?
Well, you know, the quality's not that good, so you can decide which one you want to connect. Want to hold on to the boat and really decide what works. No. And what I was, I'm pretty sure it's in your end, to be honest, because.
So all of these companies use life cycle analysis to measure the inputs and outputs of their systems. And they can demonstrate carbon cycles that continue to improve while gasoline continues to get worse. Life cycle analysis doesn't simply enable comparison among our energy choices, it requires it. We can't claim that one form of biofuel is better than another, or that biofuels are better than petroleum unless we compare them and utilize the exact same metrics. So if we take an inventory of all the energy and carbon flows in production of fossil fuels, we have to use the same metrics that we used for biofuels. If we assess biofuel production a carbon debt for using carbon stored in biomass, why shouldn't we recognize that oil owes a carbon debt for what's pulling out of the ground, where it was stored effectively for 1 million years? And can this life cycle be improved? Yes, it can. Refining oil is very, very efficient now. It's been improved for 100 years. So for every 42-gallon barrel of oil, you get more than 42 gallons of products out of it. But the fact is, over the past decade, oil production's carbon intensity has gotten much, much worse. Fracking, it uses chemical energy to recover oil now, in addition to the mechanical energy. And that increases the carbon intensity of drilling oil. Furthermore, most of the less valuable products from drilling oil and gas are simply flared, burned off right at the production site. And that puts carbon right into the air without any sort of compensating benefit. There's no price on carbon in this life cycle. There's no mechanism within this system, either in the marketplace or in regulations, to incentivize the reabsorption of carbon emissions. The oil industry could pay to offset its emissions in some way, just like anyone else could. But that's a business decision. That's not a permanent market mechanism. And deciding not to pay those offsets wouldn't put the oil company out of business the same way it would a farmer. So if a farmer doesn't replant, he's out of business. So it's thoroughly inappropriate to assign any carbon uptake mechanism to the oil industry. And I think there are a lot of models out there that do that. Now, land use change. Land use change has been incorporated into life cycle analysis for biofuels for more than a decade now. It's not a difficult concept to understand. When any land is tilled or plowed or cleared, there's a carbon flow. Even if a field is being converted from one use to another, if the farmer rotates corn and soy, there's a soil carbon loss that has to be accounted in the final product. So the graph here on the left illustrates data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And what it shows is that over the past 20 years, the number of acres that have been planted to field crops, and these are the major ones, corn, soy, cotton, has fluctuated within a very narrow range of 20 million acres. And that sounds like a lot, but we're talking about 320 to 340 million acres. So it's about 6% of the total. So we can understand from this data that biofuel crops, if they displaced any other crops, it was within the United States and within the same relative number of planted acres. So what's happened with the increase in biofuel crops is that they've been stocks per acre or extra rotation of crops within the same year. There's no corresponding evidence to suggest that biofuel production here in the United States caused crop shifting in other countries. Land use change within the United States is very observable and measurable. But the assumption that it causes international indirect land use change is still driven by assumption. And at the same time, in the United States, we've lost a lot of cropland. It's been converted to housing, to business districts, and other uses. And over the past decades debate, people have ignored the land use change that's caused by oil. And as I said before, if you use life cycle analysis, you have to use the same metrics. Anyone here today a geology major? All right, you'll have to take my word for it that there's a well-established body of research in the geology field on the land use change associated with oil exploration, particularly in Venezuela. So oil exploration, oil companies go into Venezuela and they have to clear roads to get to the oil exploration site. They have to clear rainforest for pipeline right of way and for housing for the oil workers. That as more of the oil workers move in, more land is cleared to provide crops for the workers. And the same phenomenon has now occurred in North Dakota. Today, North Dakota is literally visible from space. And that's due to the flaring of oil and gas drilling back in shale. And then the influx of the workers to North Dakota resulted in boom towns. So there was new housing and new accommodations that displaced prairie land. The image on the right is, yes, right, oil sand production in Alberta, Canada. And oil sands are strip mined just like coal. So whatever forest biomass or soil carbon existed above ground was just stripped away. And that evidence is getting ignored in the debate about biofuels. I've literally heard people claim that oil comes out of a small hole in the ground and therefore doesn't cause any land use change. But those two sources of oil are now what makes up the majority of what we use here in the United States. And that's a huge change from the decades ago. But in our regulatory policy today, the carbon score of oil is frozen at the 2005 level, back when most of our oil came from the Middle East, and most of the carbon, or most of the carbon flows were located in the Middle East. So we haven't updated our policy, and there's a very good reason behind that. The goal of the RFS was to reduce carbon emissions below our 2005 level to ensure that there was actually a reduction in carbon emissions. But anyway, I'm going to sum up my points here. And the first is that the proper analogy for addressing carbon pollution is the tragedy of the commons. We have to assess industries and actors and compare them to one another to determine which are contributing the most to the tragedy. And in my opinion, any model that assigns a carbon storage benefit to fossil fuels is just inappropriate. The biofuels can be done right, depending on how they're produced. And what we have today are cellulosic, algae, and other advanced biofuels coming online. They aren't automatically better, but they can use the life cycle analysis to prove how good they are. And in comparison to oil, I think they win out in our case. And with that, I'll take any questions.
We have a very, very good and engaged group, and we are about 5 minutes, and we're going to be out of time, except that we're the last session of the day. So if you're interested in sticking around, I would really encourage it, because Dr. Sertinger here has really got a pretty good presentation, and I'd like Dr. Petruccio also to talk about what he's doing. So with that, if you all don't mind, if you have to leave, go ahead, but if you don't, I would encourage you to stay. So with that, Tim, why don't you, I'm going to pull your presentation up here.
It's right here.
He's got the big
I'm going to pull it up on the big one here, since we don't need it for Skype. Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, great. So you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much for having me, letting me hook in by phone, because I had another commitment here. As Paul, I think, indicates, or John indicates, that a lot of what I'm presenting today is set forth not just in academic papers, but in a report for the World Resources Institute. And I think Paul was going to make that available. So if you have questions or want to go into anything in greater detail, you can take a look at that.
Yeah, let me just jump in here. Copies of these presentations, the PowerPoints, and the paper that Tim is talking about here will be posted on the Precarious Alliance website, so they will be there, and you'll have access to those. I have limited copies.
So if we go on to slide 2, from my perspective, I think the small parts of the last presentation I heard a lot of talk about technology. And from my perspective, bioenergy is all about land. Bioenergy, in almost all cases, is about using land to produce plants, and then using those plants for energy. And the basic question about bioenergy is, when you use land for energy, you're sacrificing the uses of land for other purposes, and is that a good deal? And also, what do we need the other land for? So let's just start off with the global land use situation. So today, we use about half of all the world's vegetated land for agriculture. And if you go on to the third slide, the basic situation we face is that we need to produce about 70% more crops by 2050. We need to produce more than 70% more milk and meat by 2050, most of which is, at least beef and dairy are produced from grazing land. And pretty much everybody who makes projections believes that even without bioenergy, we're going to increase the amount of land we're devoting to agricultural use. And this is a paper that gives you some estimates. To give you some context, the amount of land they're talking about being converted by 2050, and that conversion, of course, releases carbon and harms biodiversity. That amount of land is about twice the amount of land that we converted from 1961 to 2006. So during 1961 to 2006, we had the Green Revolution, we doubled irrigation, we brought scientifically bred seeds to much of the world, we had a dramatic increase in yield, and we still converted about 500 million hectares of land, which is about 60% of the continental U.S. That's one way to think about that size area. And that, of course, is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. And the projection here is that we'll have to convert about twice as much as that. Now, others have smaller projections, but almost everyone agrees we're going to have to convert more for the simple reason that the amount of food that we need to produce, the additional amount of food we need to produce by 2050, is more per year than the growth in the past. And meanwhile, we've lost some of these very easy ways of boosting yield. And if you go on to the fourth slide, you can see that this is not merely theoretical. For about 20 years until the early 2000s, the area used to produce the 15 major crops basically did not increase globally. And over the last 10 years, it's been increasing at a rate of about 10 million hectares per year. And part of that's because of bioenergy, part of it's because of accelerating food demand, but the bottom line is we're not able to keep up. And if you go on to the next slide, the key points here is that all of this is without regard to bioenergy. So bioenergy is very inefficient. And because of that, you need an enormous amount of land, an enormous amount of plants to produce a pretty small amount of energy. So the U.S. target right now is about 13 or 14% of transportation fuel energy to come from bioenergy. Europe used to have a 10% target, it's reduced it to 8%. So we did a little analysis and said, well, how much of the world's crop energy, how much of the actual physical energy present in all the world's crops would you need to produce 10% of the world's transportation fuel in 2050? And to give you some idea, that 10% of the world's transportation fuel would only be produced about 2% of the world's delivered energy. And to do that, you need 30% of all of the energy in all the world's crops. And this is a very easy calculation. It doesn't require, it has nothing to do with efficiency or anything like that. It simply has to do with the actual amount of energy that is present in the biomass. And if you go to the next slide, there are people who advocate that we have a goal of producing 20% of the world's energy from bioenergy in 2050. 180 exajoules. That's kind of the unit that people use for very large amounts of energy. And then you can ask, well, how much energy in biomass would be needed to produce 180 exajoules? And that's probably about at least 220, because it's 180 assumes that fossil fuel is built. We can't use biomass as efficiently as fossil fuel. So just give a little penalty, and you're up to 225 or so, 230 exajoules. And so how much of the world's biomass is that? Well, that is equal to all the world's harvested biomass. All of the crops that we grow, all the crop residues that we harvest, all of the grass eaten by livestock, and all of the wood harvested for whatever purpose in the world. And this number is a pretty well-known number. I mean, it's rough in some ways. It's cited by the IPCC. And so to produce 20% of the world's energy for bioenergy, you would have to double the harvest of plant material on the planet. And you'd have to do that even while producing 70% more crops for food, more than 70% more grass for livestock, and probably more than 70% more wood. So that gives you the idea of the scope of the potential environmental effects. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the reason for this is basically that bioenergy is just astonishingly inefficient. The most efficient form of bioenergy we have today, sorry, I just lost my, is sugarcane ethanol. And that's more efficient than other forms of bioenergy because it's a perennial crop. You're growing it year-round in a very good soil with a lot of water, and mostly in Brazil. And that converts 0.2% of solar radiation into the energy in the actual ethanol. Not 2%, 0.2%. And for corn ethanol, it's about 0.1%. And even if we become spectacularly good at producing cellulosic ethanol, and we look at the place where the single location in the United States where DOE projects we will produce the most switchgrass, you're only up to 0.35%. Now, to give you by contrast, if you went out and bought a solar cell today, it would produce 16%. And even on a net basis, when you account for all the energy needed to produce it, various other land use issues, you're talking about 11%. So if you were kind of silly enough, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you were kind of silly enough to say, well, where we want to produce solar energy is actually the world's best farmland rather than dry land, you'd still produce about 55 times more energy than even sugarcane ethanol. And that number keeps going up. So last weekend, a company announced that it will be commercially producing over 20% efficient solar cell. And while solar cell for solar energy can't be stored as easily, we can increase our solar production by 20-fold at least without even coming into storage issues. And that gives us time to solve storage issues. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that this is focusing on the world's best land. We did an analysis that makes kind of optimistic assumptions of future bioenergy and compare that to solar energy production using technologies off the shelf today. And on 75% of the world's land, the lowest efficiency ratio would be 100 to 1. On 25% of the world's land, you would produce more than 5,000 times as much energy using solar cells as bioenergy. So if you go to the next slide, the bottom line is that bioenergy is kind of the Hummer of global land use. It's just extraordinarily inefficient. And that explains why, that earlier slide, why you need roughly all the world's biomass, harvested biomass, to produce about 20% of the world's energy. So now, let me go into the kind of question. Well, so where do we get this kind of interest in bioenergy? Well, given these numbers, which are very basic calculations, doesn't take a lot of modeling. You know, anyone there could actually come up with this analysis in a couple hours. Show you the right sources. And so it comes from a kind of an accounting error. And let me start this way. Let's start with the basic recognition that plant growth is being used. It's being used for food, it's being used for timber, it's being used to sequester carbon, keep it out of the atmosphere by storing carbon. And a large part of it is being used to replenish that stored carbon. Microorganisms are always consuming that carbon, so we want the Earth to continue to have forests, store carbon. You got to kind of add more plant growth every year. So what that means, rather obviously, is that if you want energy, and you want to do it without losing those other benefits of plant growth that are already occurring, you need to produce additional plant growth. Or you need to find some waste that is being used. Now, the problem is that people haven't really done that. If you go on to the slide 12, did you have a kind of a flowing slide in there? Anyway, the slide that says large bioenergy.
We're right there.
Okay. So, you kind of ask the question, where do people come up with these estimates for large quantities of bioenergy, given the fact that like a 20% estimate requires you double the harvest of all harvested plant material? So the short answer is that if you look at the underlying studies, and there are remarkably small numbers that then get cited over and over again, they're basically counting either land or biomass or carbon that's already being used, and assuming you can use it for bioenergy without cost. So kind of the most extreme version of this, you go back to the IPCC report of 2001, and that report suggested that you could sustainably produce carbon-free bioenergy equal to roughly 100% of then energy demand. You say, okay, where did that come from? Well, what they said was, we use about 1.5 billion hectares of cropland, and but there's about 3 billion hectares of potential cropland. So if we took all of the 1.5 billion hectares of potential cropland that are not being used for crop, and use that for bioenergy, and we achieve very high yields, how much energy could we get? And the problem with that is that the 1.5 billion hectares of potential cropland that aren't being used include the world's forests that are already storing vast areas of carbon but could produce crops if we chop them down, and the world's wetter grazing lands that are already producing food, and a lot of the world's wetter savannas that I'll talk about later. So these lands are already storing carbon, and if you convert them to bioenergy, you lose all that carbon storage. You lose the grass production, you lose all these other benefits. And another big example of this is, now, this is particularly acute with regard to trees. Some people suggest, well, what if we harvest all the wood and forests that we're adding each year in some forests in the world, a lot of forests in the world, we're actually adding forest growth, and we're not harvesting it all. So why don't we use the rest for bioenergy? Well, by definition, if you're adding carbon to the forest, that's already storing carbon, keeping it away from the atmosphere, helping to hold down climate change. And in fact, a lot of that carbon that's being added to the forest is due to climate change itself. We believe that every time we put a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, about a quarter of that gets taken up by additional forest growth, spurred by that higher carbon dioxide. And we factor that into all of our projections of climate change. So if you harvest that wood and burn it and put the carbon back in the atmosphere, you're adding carbon to the atmosphere. Anyway, I'll keep moving because a little faster, so I'll skip 2 slides. And but we go into all the different forms of double counting before. And let me go to slide 14. So this form of double counting is also the source of the belief that bioenergy produces a lot of greenhouse gas benefits. So let's take a step back. And when you burn biomass, you actually put carbon in the atmosphere. So just like when you burn coal or you burn natural gas or oil, you're putting carbon in the atmosphere. And in fact, you have to produce at least a little bit more carbon than when you burn fossil fuels, because there's more carbon per unit of energy in biomass than there is in fossil fuels. But the most important thing is just do roughly the same. So why do people think that bioenergy can reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And the answer is that you start with plant growth. So you see these little kind of slides on the left and the bottom. And the idea is this is a circle. Plant growth absorbs carbon. When you burn it, you're just putting carbon back in the atmosphere. It's just carbon recycling. So basically, this theory is that plants are basically free sources of carbon. Now this is a mistake. If you go on to the next slide, here's the way to think about it. And then I'll show you in more detail. The argument that plant growth reduces carbon dioxide ultimately is that plant growth serves as an offset. What comes out of your car doesn't change. What comes out of your power plant doesn't change. But it's offset by plant growth. Now, what's the first rule of any offset? The first rule is it has to be additional. If you worked overtime and your boss said, I'm going to compensate you, I'm going to offset you for your effort by giving you vacation time, he'd have to give you additional vacation time. He couldn't just say, I'm going to offset it by letting you take the vacation you've already earned. And similarly, if you want to use plant growth to offset energy emissions, you can't take credit for plants that would grow anyway, forests that would grow anyway, forests that are already storing carbon anyway, even crops that would grow anyway, because they're already growing anyway. So that's not an offset. Now, if you see, this actually, I'm going to jump this slide just because we're going to run out of time. And go to the next slide, which is slide 17. But let me just say about the earlier slide. I won't go into detail, but you can study it another time. When people do life cycle analyses, these calculations that look at the emissions with bioenergy and compare those to the emissions of gasoline, the bottom line is that if you just counted the actual emissions, you would have dramatically higher emissions from biofuels. In the case of ethanol, it's because it takes a lot more energy to actually produce the ethanol than it does to, quote, produce gasoline. And also, actually, you release, in addition to the carbon that you release out of the tailpipe of a car, you actually release carbon from the fermentation process and turning starches into biofuels. And so if you actually counted the carbon released by the car and released by the biofuel plant, you end up with roughly twice the emissions of gasoline. But if you ignore the carbon that's released from the plants, you can then claim a greenhouse gas benefit. So this argument that plants are carbon-free is inherent in the argument that biofuels reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if you go to the next slide, here's an example of where that would be true. So imagine you have a bare piece of land and you're burning gas. And now you want to switch to biofuels. And the way you produce your biofuels is you take that bare piece of land, you irrigate it, and you grow a lot of plant material. And then you turn that plant material into ethanol. Now in this case, what's actually being emitted by the car remains the same. But you do get a greenhouse gas benefit. Where do you get the benefit? You actually get it in the field. You get it in the field because the plants in that field, that additional plant growth, has absorbed additional carbon. And you can see from that green line going down, that's where the greenhouse gas benefit is. It's all based on additional plant growth.